All right, welcome everybody to our first official podcast of Ridge Talk here at South Ridge Church. We're just getting back into things here in the church office after a really busy Holy Week. We had a special Sunday evening service on Palm Sunday, just a prayer service. We had a Good Friday service, which was completely separate from our Easter services. And then, of course, we had 2 Easter morning services, and it was just an incredible week. I think people really got a lot out of it. But as we get into the podcast here, we really just wanted to take an opportunity to kind of set some expectations for you all as to just what this was going to look like as we get into the different questions that we received after Sunday's message. So Daniel's going to talk a little bit about that and just kind of how we break things down into, well, we call them jars.
Yeah, well, first of all, and the reason we're needing to set some expectations, here we are week 1, and we've already received more questions than we can reasonably and responsibly answer in a single episode. And so we immediately had to have a conversation.
That's a good problem.
It's a good problem.
Yep.
We had to have a conversation about, okay, well, how do we prioritize this? So the first thing I'll say, if your question does not get answered on Ridge Talk, you will receive an answer to that question. It'll just be, through an email or text or some other way. But we want you to know we want to answer as many questions as possible. So you will get an answer to your question. It just might not be on the podcast. The other thing we said, okay, well, how are we going to prioritize this? And Justin kind of set me up for that. Is we want to talk. We want to prioritize things based on our jars. So one of the things we talk about in our membership document is our unity jars. Is that what we call them? Unity jars. And Luch is he's kind of renamed some of his stuff, and it's really, really good. But the idea is, I think I know what our membership document says. We have 5 jars. Luch brought it down into 4 jars. I really like those. Jar 1 is hills that we die on. This is anything that's based in the gospel or based on orthodoxy. In other words, if you go outside of these things, one of these doctrines, you're not even a Christian. Jar 2 is hills we stand on. And so those are like really important doctrines that inform kind of the way we live and the way we worship. Maybe even separating, like we're not even able to worship together if we don't agree on these things. The jar 3 or level 3 is kind of hills that we dialogue on, which means, hey, these are probably important things, but they're not going to divide us. We're going to be able to worship together, serve together. Open-handed, and we're going to have good conversations about it. Some of my favorite conversations are about those things. Yep. And then jar 4 is molehills, which is just like, listen, I don't want to talk about the color of the carpet or how loud the music was. Like, those aren't things that we're going to talk about. So,
or theological speculation, things that we just we don't know.
Speculation, or got the word wrong, but it's speculation or preference. Anything that has to do with speculation or preference, it's like, listen, we don't need to spend a lot of time talking about those things because they don't really inform the way we live our lives and the way we're formed. So. Anyways, that's kind of how we prioritize things. Did I miss anything on kind of the prioritization of stuff?
I think also we just we want to try to prioritize questions that are directly related to sermons. So a lot of the weeks we're asking you to respond to things that came up that particular week. And so we would start with the things that we feel directly apply to a weekly sermon. And then other things that might be adjacent to that or slightly outside of that, we'll do our best to address one way or the other. Like Daniel said, maybe on the podcast, maybe privately with you. But as we said, we just are getting a lot more questions than what we anticipated, and we want to try to do our best to handle all of these with care and make sure that we honor the time that you guys are spending submitting those questions. So that being said, I actually have this week's round of questions for us that came in. They started rolling in even just right after the 9 a.m. service,
like
on
while
Sunday.
I was talking, even.
Yeah, we were pleasantly surprised that people were engaging with this right away. And so some of these are going to be questions that came from an individual. Others of them at times might be, hey, we got a few questions and we're doing our best to word them in a way that kind of encompasses a couple different questions that we felt were similar. But here's the first question that we received on Sunday, and it's a question related to the topic of soul sleep, and it says, "My question is about being asleep and resurrecting when Christ comes back. When we die, is your understanding that we will not immediately join Christ in heaven? Will we remain in the grave until he comes back? Where does 2 Corinthians 5:8 fit in? And what about Enoch and Elijah, who didn't physically die?"
Yeah, it's amazing that the very first question is like 4 questions. So, but I'm going to try to hit all those because I think those are really helpful. And by the way, it's a great question. And I think, questions like this, it kind of draw out some of the implications of what we're talking about. They're really helpful because they help to kind of reinforce our beliefs and to kind of sturdy the foundations of our faith. And so, anyways, those are helpful. So, on the one hand, I'll say that it's not like we have no information about some of those things. We actually do have some information. But before I say anything else, I'll also say we're comfortable embracing mystery because sometimes there's just mystery and it's okay to embrace mystery. So 2 Corinthians 5:8 was brought up, which some translations say to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And I think that's exactly true. So one of the things I said everyone dies 2 deaths. The first is kind of the death that your spirit, you kind of die as you, like when you sin, like you live the majority of your existence on earth apart from Jesus, you're living in kind of a state of spiritual deadness. It's the same thing that Adam and Eve had in the garden, that God said, on the day that you eat of this fruit, you're surely going to die. And then they lived for like 900 more years. And so the idea was that their souls, their spirits died that day. But then there is physical death that occurs, at which point our spirit or our soul, it leaves our body. We're disconnected from that. So Christian theology teaches that we are embodied persons, that our actual person is our spirit, it is our soul. But we are also connected to our bodies. Those things work together. And the moment we die physically, our spirits are separated from our bodies. So the question is, well, what happens then? And I would say in the New Testament, the answer is pretty clear. It's to be absent. It's 2 Corinthians 5:8. To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. The body goes in the ground and rots and decays. The spirit goes and is immediately present with God. Although not in the final sense. We see in the book of Revelation that there's going to be a new creation, new heaven, new earth. I think it's this earth, but like renewed and reformed, maybe even better than it was before. And so we will exist as embodied persons in eternity. But during this intermediate stage, our spirits leave our bodies and they go to be, those who have faith in Christ go to be present with God, and those who do not have faith in Jesus Christ are separated from the presence of God's love for eternity until the time when really Scripture teaches there is a resurrection of every single person, both those who believe and those who did not believe. Daniel, the book of Daniel talks about this. Some will rise to everlasting glory, and some to everlasting contempt. And so,
it's an interesting question. I mean, you have the thief by Jesus on the cross. Jesus says, "Today you'll be with me in paradise."
Right.
So I adhere to the same mindset, same belief you have there. I will note just real quick that, I've had conversations with people who do think about this differently than I do. And the conversation boiled down to me saying something like, so what you're telling me is that the first thing that you realize after death is that you're in the presence of Christ, right? So whether you're sleeping or not sleeping, that's the first thing that you get to experience is presence with Christ. And they were like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, then why do we have to have a big disagreement on this? Like, it doesn't really matter that much.
I think one of the questions gets back into what happened to the Old Testament saints. Yeah. What happened to people who died before Jesus came? Hebrews 11 is really helpful for helping us process that. It's clear all the way back to Abel. By faith, Abel offered this. By faith, Abraham did this. By faith, Rahab. And it just goes on and on and on. So it's clear that whatever happened to them after they died, whether it was a soul sleep or not, I don't know that there's really a clear understanding of that in the Old Testament one way or the other. The Old Testament really just talks about Sheol, it's a generic place of the dead. Mm-hmm. It's possible that they were resting. It's also possible that God knew and that those who had faith in God went immediately to be present with him, and those who didn't went somewhere else.
And this is absolutely a great case study of where we say embracing mystery is important. sometimes it's better to admit, hey, it's not clear enough to draw a specific conclusion.
Correct.
Rather than trying to put something out there in the world that is a definitive statement on something, that we can actually be comfortable with a certain amount of mystery that doesn't affect, like you talked about earlier, orthodox belief, doesn't affect an ability to have unity together. And so this is a great example of somewhere where we would just say, we're either not smart enough, don't have enough experience, there isn't enough consensus among theologians to give definitive statements on every case.
This would fall honestly all the way at the bottom of that in jar 4. The concept of soul sleep, it's speculation.
Yeah.
It's really speculation at that point. And so
Yeah, it's always a good principle to try to understand the difficult to understand passages in light of the easy to understand passages. And some of these passages are more difficult. So we spend our time thinking through.
There's one other part of that question I want to hit real quick, because it did ask about Enoch and Elijah, right? And so I did say it's the curse that's common to all humanity, except for the fact that we kind of believe the Bible teaches at least 2 people in the Old Testament never died. So, which was Enoch in the book of Genesis and Elijah, who was carried up by a chariot of fire. And it's a great question. And again, therein lies the mystery. That would be, though, those are anomalies, right? Those are exceptions to the rule rather than the rule itself. So even saying specific things about that would not be helpful. The only thing I really do think that we could say is that whatever happened to their bodies after that moment, I don't think they have glorified bodies now. I don't think they received glorified bodies before Jesus received a glorified body. So I think they were spiritually present. We see Elijah at the transfiguration, right? In kind of spiritual, but somehow a bodily form. It's hard. They somehow knew it was Moses and Elijah, but we don't really know much beyond that.
Yeah. Well, good. We hope that answers your question. We did our best there with that one, but seriously, thank you for that question. It shows a great amount of insight, and there's some complexity there. Question number 2, it says, some people say that Jesus was dead for 3 days, but Friday to Sunday would be maybe less than 48 hours. Is this significant?
It could be significant if people were claiming 2 different things. I think it's possible that there's just kind of a misstatement. People misstate things, or there's a misunderstanding somewhere there. The statement was that Jesus would rise again on the 3rd day. So if you're counting it's less than 48 hours. I mean, it's something like 36 hours. We know he died around 3 p.m. On Friday, and then he was up before the people entered around sunrise on Sunday. So it's less than 48 hours. But if you count Friday as the first day, Saturday as the second day, and Sunday as the 3rd day, he rose from the dead on the 3rd day.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be a literal 72 hours, I think.
And that's the way that it is stated. It seems to come down to a semantic discrepancy there, especially as it's translated into English and we talk about those things. And as we've adapted calendars and all those different types of things, I think that we just confuse the idea of on the 3rd day rather than 3
and it's also
days
possible
later.
that when I teach, or I've said something, maybe I've said the exact words of, 3 days later. Just when you're, sometimes if you're not really careful with your exact words, it can come across incorrect. And
that's actually a little bit of the motivation behind doing a podcast like this, is we all acknowledge that when we speak, we don't always say the thing that we maybe wanted to say or needed to say. When you speak publicly, it's easy to slip up and say 3 days later rather than on the 3rd day.
Careless words like that. Yeah.
And it can lead to some confusion. And so this is yet another place where we have the opportunity to kind of clarify some things like that as well.
It's a good question, though.
Yep.
Question number 3, evidence of the resurrection. It was said that there is more proof of the resurrection than proof that Alexander the Great was alive. Can you please expound on that?
Yeah, that was something you said in the message Sunday morning. So that's
Yeah, so now I have to give account for it.
Yeah.
It's true. I think so. I went back and looked at it. What I actually had written down. What I said was we have more evidence and better evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ than we have for any other event in the ancient world, including the existence and the work of Alexander the Great. Maybe an even clearer and more precise statement is that we have more eyewitness testimonies and earlier eyewitness testimonies for the resurrection of Jesus than we have for Alexander the Great. Some works that I kind of looked at. By the way, there's a lot of resources that are available for this kind of stuff. Some of the more accessible ones would be like Lee Strobel's Case for Christ, Case for Easter. Is it Josh McDowell who's got Evidence That Demands a Verdict? I've also been looking at Reinventing Jesus is a really good apologetic work. And then Frank Turek has a book out, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. It's a very provocative title. But all of them have proofs and evidences for some of the more difficult things that we see in scriptures, including the resurrection. They all talk about the resurrection. When it comes to resources, we absolutely have more eyewitness and earlier eyewitness testimonies for the resurrection of Jesus Christ than anything else. So, for instance, with Alexander the Great, we have the earliest. Like Suetonius was one of the ones who did a lot of the history on Alexander the Great. Suetonius was writing 300 years after Alexander the Great had already died. And the earliest manuscripts that we have of that is from the 9th century AD. Wow. So now we're talking like 1,200 years after Alexander the Great. That's the earliest manuscript evidence we have for that. If you contrast that with the manuscript evidence we have for the New Testament, we have 5,700 and counting early manuscripts, Greek manuscripts that are detailing, and they're not all about the resurrection, but they are about the life of Jesus that also include the resurrection. If that number jumps to about 15,000 if you also include Latin manuscripts, and it jumps to over 1 million quotations when you look at early church fathers quoting the early scriptures. And so we have what some have referred to as an embarrassment of riches when it comes to that. Yeah. And so the sheer volume of the eyewitness accounts that we have, scripture itself, we know Paul says there were over 500 people saw Jesus alive after his resurrection. Yeah. And those, the earliest manuscripts we have for the New Testament are within 100 to 150 years of those. And we have those manuscripts right now. And they were writing not 300 years after, but 20 to 30 years after it happened. And so we have much earlier eyewitness accounts and way, way more than we have for any other event. By the way, Alexander the Great would be one of the close ones. Homer, any of Homer's stuff. Yeah, and then I've heard that stuff like Livy and Suetonius and some of those guys. Suetonius, we have over 200 early documents. But like I said, we have over 5,700 early documents when it comes to early manuscripts when it comes to the New Testament. So
you mentioned the Apostle Paul writing about 500 eyewitnesses of the resurrection, but he also said many of them are still alive.
And you can check with
he
them.
was putting that out there as a hey, you can go check. They're still alive. Right. So that was just really him throwing down the gauntlet of you can't disprove this. And there's a lot of people who have seen it. You can go talk to them and ask them about it.
Yeah. So I'll just throw something else in there that's not related to that. I think that answers the question of like, how do we contrast the historical thing between, the resurrection and Alexander, but just the historical reality that, Jesus was killed, officially by the Romans for officially claiming to be the king of the Jews, which would make him an opponent of Caesar. And within 300 years, without Christians ever leading a rebellion, without them ever lifting up a sword, Christianity had overwhelmed the Roman Empire, and even Caesar himself was bowing.
Yeah,
that's incredible.
Interesting.
It's fascinating. There.
I think in our discussions before we sat down to record today, we did talk about the fact that kind of how we would summarize that is that the resurrection is a real event. These questions, how they connect, being accurate with how we would express 3 days later versus on the third day matters because it's historically accurate. It's a real event. It's portraying something that took place. And one of the other things that kind of came up in your sermon was the impact that the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus had on a real person.
Yes.
You talked about Thomas, and Thomas is one of the disciples. And actually, I think he's the guy that maybe gets a bit of an unfair treatment historically. In many circles, he's known as Doubting Thomas because he expresses doubt when he hears about the fact that Jesus has risen from the dead. He basically says, unless I can see him and touch him, I'm not going to believe it. And I think what happens with that is that gets interpreted as this sort of sterile, hundreds and thousands of years removed view of a real person,
Right.
who just witnessed the collapse of everything that he had dedicated his life to. He lost his rabbi. He lost the person that he had come to know as the Messiah, his friend. The overwhelming amount of disorientation that Thomas must have been feeling, the amount of grief that he must have been feeling. I think the way that I tend to read that is Thomas isn't trying to put some sort of intellectual argument in place saying, oh, I don't believe this unless I have proof. I think what we see is a picture of a real human being struggling with grief and loss and saying, I can't bear to hope in the resurrection. I can't bear to hope that what you're saying is true.
Yeah, don't dare give me hope.
And so what happens there is Thomas expresses that in community. He's with other disciples and other people. They've just shared the news that Jesus has resurrected with him. And he expresses that level of doubt. And what we don't see in that community is we don't see them rebuking him for that. We don't see a rejection of Thomas where they're like, hey, Thomas, like we told you this is real. We don't see reactions like that. We don't see other people trying to tender arguments to convince him, right? And we talked about the importance of building communities that allow people to have a safe place to express their doubt, to have a culture within a community where people, for whatever reason, whether it's grief and loss, whether it might be intellectual disagreements, whether it might be indifference, which we'll touch on here in a moment, there are many reasons why people might find themselves doubting. And you expressed that we want to be a place that creates a culture and an environment where people are safe to express their doubt. And we have that in a real embodied example in Thomas. The other interesting thing that happens there then is Thomas expresses that doubt in community. It doesn't show us that he's rejected or rebuked for expressing that doubt. But what we also see is the thing that helps Thomas overcome that doubt and come to a place of healing is a real encounter with Jesus. And so Jesus comes into the midst of that community. It says that many people were gathered in that room. Jesus came in their midst, and Thomas sees him, talks to him, touches the wounds in his body. And that brings the healing and the revelation that the resurrection was real to him. And the interesting thing about that is there are still those two components that we're talking about. There's a community surrounding him.
Right.
And within that community, he's having a real encounter with Jesus. And man, if I could label the perfect goal for a church, I think I would boil it down to something very similar, that we would be a community that would strive to bring people into real encounters with Jesus, and not just be people who are trying to lob facts or win arguments or try to convince people through clever discourse. That helps, but ultimately what takes information and helps it become transformation is real encounter with Jesus.
That's exactly right.
And Jesus' whole response was come closer to me. Like, Jesus didn't scold Thomas. He didn't,
Yeah.
he wasn't ridiculing him in any way. It was, hey, Thomas, come closer to me.
Yes.
And Thomas did, and it changed his life.
And Luch, I love what you brought up when we were talking about this as well. It's reminiscent of that passage in Mark where the man says to Jesus, I believe, but help my unbelief.
Right.
I think that's more of what was going on with Thomas of like, man, I want to believe so badly what you're telling me, that Jesus is alive, that every, like this level of disillusionment that I'm feeling and this hopelessness that I'm feeling, that there's an answer to that. But I can't get there. And what we see is just this beautiful expression of an encounter with Jesus, just changing all of that. And historically, what we believe about Thomas is that he actually traveled as far as India with the gospel. Many claim that that's where he was martyred, I believe, or at least where he died. And so obviously something profound happened with him. He was convinced from that point forward.
Yeah, doubting Thomas became shouting Thomas.
Yeah.
He couldn't stop shouting the gospel as far as India. It's incredible.
Thanks for that pun.
Hey, and I'll just say on that Mark, I think it's Mark 9:24, I believe, help my unbelief. Like, I hope this is a safe enough space to say this, but like that has been my lived experience for a lot of my life. Just like I hear this, like we're talking about the topic here, the resurrection, or all the things that the implications that has for our lives. Man, I believe, like, to be clear, I believe. And yet, how much of my life, just being honest, has been marked by, but help my unbelief. Like, I want to believe it more fully. I want to trust that completely. But if that's true, then that has so many implications, and it's a little scary. And like, there's so much to that.
Absolutely.
And so I just say that to say, like, I don't know if that's, if you guys have anything to that, like what to the person who would say, yeah, I feel that. Like, I believe, I get it, I'm with it, but also, it's really help my unbelief. I want to believe it more.
I'm convinced that, the Bible is filled with miracles. The resurrection being near the top of those miracles of like incredible things that have happened. I think it's equally miraculous when someone's heart moves from unbelief to belief. I mean, it is a miracle of God working upon the heart. Honestly, I kind of talked a little bit. I talked about the women who were initially at the tomb and they experienced joy at the news. And then we talked about kind of the religious leaders, Pharisees. And then we also talked about the Thomas doubting. The reality is both the religious leaders and Thomas doubted the news.
Yeah.
But there's different types of doubts.
Yep.
And they come from a different place. The religious leaders' doubt came from a place of, I refuse to believe, so I doubt everything you're saying. Versus exactly with Thomas' doubt was, I want desperately to believe. I just don't know if I can. There's something that's in conflict within me that needs to be resolved. Yeah. And I think, by the way, there are some doubts that maybe never get resolved. Yeah. And that's okay. I think learning to live within the mystery, that's part of what it means to live by faith. It doesn't mean there's not good evidence for things, but it just means that we're so broken, maybe we don't even receive that evidence all the time.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think there's different kinds of doubt. That's absolutely, Luch, of course. I mean, you're definitely not alone in experiencing doubts. And, I mean, we've got like 4 pastors, ministers sitting here, and I think we would all acknowledge there are doubts that creep in. And we have moments and even seasons of doubt, and those could be for a variety of reasons. But
well, again, I'm like, that's what I'm kind of saying. Like, even like Thomas, like it's like, I believe, but then it's like, but in this area of my life, like, if I believe this, then like
the implications for that are far-reaching. That's exactly
well,
right.
I think your example of like the difference between Thomas and the religious leaders goes back to motivated reasoning. The religious leaders had a different motivation for wanting to deny that the resurrection could be true than what Thomas would have had. And I think that is what we will encounter as we come up against people's doubts. There are all sorts of different motivations, whether conscious or unconscious, in them for those doubts. One of the things that you touched on, and I think that, Luch, we talked about it a little bit too, is the idea of indifference.
Yeah.
Like, even if we get to this point where we acknowledge, hey, this was a real thing that happened to real people, it still can be met with, okay, so what does that have to do with me?
Right.
Why does it matter? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll just be honest, like that has been a lot of when I've been in places where I can talk about Jesus, talk about the resurrection, talk about, hey, this matters. Unfortunately, that's been a pretty common response that I've kind of received on the other end is people, it's kind of like but
So what?
so what? Exactly. Like that was thousands of, whether that's true or not, like you just said. And so I'd love to point us to 1 Corinthians 15 on that. I was thinking through that idea. A couple of things that Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, if Christ, he's talking about the idea of the resurrection, and then he talks about some other things farther down, but if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. So this is a pretty important, pretty important deal. Like he hangs the whole of the Christian faith on this idea of there being a resurrection and Jesus resurrected. A little farther down, he says, 1 Corinthians 15:19, if only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied.
Yeah.
And then verse 32 I'll read as well. It says, if the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die.
Yep.
Which is, a quote from his
nihilism.
own culture. Yeah,
Right.
that's this
Nothing
idea
matters.
indifference kind of blends into nihilism. Nothing really matters. Life is meaningless. And on the one hand, I think that the truth of the resurrection, it does require a response.
Yeah.
Like the idea that Jesus said he was who he was and then died and walked out of the grave, he doesn't give us the option to say, oh yeah, that's cool.
No, you know who else talks about that was, and this is a famous thing. C.S. Lewis has his trilemma, right? Which is, well, Jesus is either a liar, a lunatic, or he's Lord, and there's no other option. Yeah. He's either lying about what happened, he's a lunatic who believes he's the Son of God, or he actually is the Son of God. Yeah. He actually is Lord. And I think it's interesting the lengths to which an unbelieving heart will go, like I said, for self-preservation. And maybe I don't want to be uncharitable at all, but when you hear about things like indifference to something like that, you're like, but that's not an option. Yeah. You cannot be indifferent without, and I mean, I guess you can, that doesn't make sense. It's illogical, and yet you're saying it's your experience with people. It's my I agree. There's that. I've seen that too a lot.
Yeah, and I guess it's similar to the thing on what we were saying on doubt. Like when you have doubts, like man, I would say if that's you or if that's someone that like you're. I mean, I have a lot of people in my life that would say I know something about Jesus, like. And just the cross, the resurrection, something, blah blah blah. They're whatever. Got some ideas about Jesus. But they're just not that concerned about it. And my heart goes to, that's someone to pray for because they've not experienced, we're talking about experiencing community and experience. Like those are the things that are going to draw someone out of that. Like those are the things that I'm praying for someone in that space, because I'm like, man, I'm not going to be able to argue you out of that space.
No, you can't.
That's an incredibly important distinction, is ultimately the desire is not to convince somebody of a set of facts,
right,
or to change their mind for the sake of changing their mind. It's out of a deep desire to say, I know the God of the universe.
Yes.
And I desperately want others to know him and know his love, because otherwise self-denial is not something that's enjoyable. That's why I love that passage where it says that if this isn't true, we're most to be pitied, because there's an element of following Jesus that is denying yourself and denying certain pleasures in this world and things that appeal to us that are fun. When I was a youth pastor, I used to tell my kids, like, hey, I'm not asking you to not do certain things because they aren't fun. Like, they're a blast for a while. but it's that there's something better. There's something in a connection with God that comes when you lay aside your own desires and pursue Him. That's better than what those things have to offer.
Well, and
and no set of facts is going to convince anybody of that.
That's the original sin, right? Believing that God is withholding something good from me.
Yeah.
Believing that there's something better when I eat the fruit.
Yep.
And it's a lie. That's the first thing. So, man, one of the things that you asked about a second ago, because I did talk about creating environments and creating a culture that does not happen overnight at all. I think doing that, it certainly requires us to model that. It's okay to doubt. It's okay to express doubt. It's okay to model that, and also then to handle it well when we experience it. That we're not immediately like, "Well, let me tell you why you're wrong about that." Yeah. But it's hey, this is a journey. Faith is a journey. A relationship with Jesus Christ, it is a journey through life that can't be answered in a simple, here's 5 facts that can change your mind,
Yeah.
I think that's part of it, is that we model it publicly. I think what I would like to see as part of our discipleship, and you mentioned community and what it means, like how important it is to have a relationship with Jesus in the context of Christian community is so vital. I think encouraging our community groups and maybe even training our leaders to say, hey, if you hear someone express doubt, don't feel like you have to fix that with 5 facts, right? Like right away. Like that's not what needs to happen in that moment. What needs to happen is that person needs to be heard. They need to be cared for.
Yes.
And then they need to be told, that's okay. There's space for that.
Yeah.
The disciples didn't tell Thomas, dude, okay, you're doubting, you're gone. Like, see you later. We're heading to Galilee. You can, find your own way somewhere.
Yep.
They said, no, just come with us. Come check it out. And they've invited him along for the journey and the process. Yeah. And I just think maybe helping to equip people and to remind people it's okay to be comfortable with the mystery, comfortable with the doubt, because that's, like I said, your heart change doesn't come necessarily through learning a set of evidences and facts. It's
definitely.
And I loved what you said in the sermon. I think it was a double portion of patience with a lot of humility thrown in.
Yes.
That's what our posture needs to be. It's so easy to just want so desperately to, that you almost have that moment of panic sometime when somebody expresses doubt. And that can override things a little bit to where you're wanting to like fix it or provide the answer right away. And I think the more important thing is that people would feel like, hey, we're with you, we're for you, and we want to walk alongside you through through doubt, through your journey of coming to know Jesus better. It's ultimately not our job to convince people. It's the Holy Spirit's work to bring people to a place of enlightenment about things relating to God, and we just do our best to model that and embody that.
Right. We're certainly not anti-knowledge, anti-education here,
Sure.
right? Like we have a good foundation of knowledge and understanding for the things we believe, but the Apostle Paul says knowledge puffs up, love builds up.
Yeah.
And the reality is, if we're only trying to answer people with knowledge-based questions with more knowledge, and we're never asking or providing guidance and leadership for, okay, here's the knowledge, how does that lead to transformation? Then we're really doing a disservice. Discipleship and growth in the Lord, like you just brought up, it requires humility. We don't have it all figured out. Patience when it's like, I don't know why you're not getting this. We got to remember, sure. I didn't always get it, And if you're only growing in knowledge and that produces pride, you're puffed up. Sure. Right, you have not. That knowledge has not led to transformation,
and yet, like we would say, it's both and.
Correct,
because we have people that work for NASA in our congregation, so it's not like knowing your stuff and knowing the intellectual side of things is not important. That's really important. It's good to have a high level understanding of things and to pursue those things. That absolutely matters, but it's coupled with love. And neither one of them replaces the
They're not
other.
mutually exclusive.
Yeah. Well, hey guys, I think that hopefully answers your questions for this week. We've really enjoyed this conversation today. We look forward to more with you. So just as a reminder, would you go to our YouTube channel, subscribe, and click the bell notification to let you know when episodes drop. You can go to our social media channels and follow us and like us there. And you can send any of your questions to the email address below or to the phone number below. You can call or text that number and we will get those questions, and we'll see you next week here on Ridge Talk. Thank you.